That night, when my husband raised his wine glass in front of his friends and called me a useless freeloader for 15 years, he had no idea that just 48 hours later, I would be the one signing the decision that fired him from the company he proudly called his empire. But what made everything fall apart was not the termination letter itself. It was the truth about who had really been paying for the house he lived in, the car he drove, and the entire life he had always believed he built with his own hands. My name is Emily Carter. I live in Seattle, in a house that anyone looking at it would assume belongs to my husband. My husband, Daniel Carter, is 45, a sales director at a fast-growing tech company, and he always tells people that he is the one carrying everything on his shoulders. Our 2 children believe that too, because they have never seen me walk into an office or talk about money. In their eyes, I am the one in the background. What no one knows is that most of the bills in this house are paid through accounts tied to a company I control. I used to work in investment, and I never truly left it. I simply chose to stay out of the spotlight, to watch, to remember, and to protect my family in my own way. But recently, as Daniel's words grew sharper and colder, and another woman began appearing in his life, I realized that my silence was being misunderstood in a dangerous way. That evening began like so many other evenings in my house, with warm yellow lighting, soft jazz drifting from the speakers in the living room, and the smell of grilled meat filling the air. I stood in the kitchen, my hands moving quickly as I arranged each plate, checking everything one last time before bringing it out to the table. Daniel had invited a close group of colleagues over, the kind of people he always wanted to impress, and I knew the night mattered to him. Through the glass, I saw him standing in the middle of the living room with a glass of red wine in hand, laughing and talking as if the room were his private stage. People gathered around him, listening, nodding, laughing at the stories he told with that familiar self-assurance. When I brought the tray of food out, a few people turned and thanked me politely, but their attention quickly shifted back to Daniel. He started talking about work, about major contracts, about pressure and success, and then the conversation naturally drifted toward family life. I set the tray down on the table and stood nearby, fully aware of the way people's eyes passed over me as though I were part of the setting rather than one of the main characters. Daniel raised his glass, his voice carrying clearly through the room, filled with the pride he always liked to display in front of others. "To be honest, without me, this family wouldn't function," he said, half joking and half serious, making everyone laugh. He glanced at me, the smile still there, but his eyes held something else. "Emily has a pretty comfortable life. She doesn't have to worry about money. I take care of all of that." One of the women in the group, probably a colleague's wife, turned to me and asked in a friendly tone, "So, what did you do before? Are you thinking about going back to work?" I smiled and kept my voice light. "I'm still working, just in my own way." Daniel laughed immediately, cutting me off before I could say anything more. "What she means is managing the house and watching Netflix," he said, joking, but loud enough for the whole room to hear. "Trust me, that's a full-time job too." Laughter broke out again, louder this time, longer. I could feel the atmosphere shift, the way people looked at me with a mix of sympathy and judgment, as if they had just learned something important about my role in this family. I nodded slightly, said nothing more, and turned back toward the kitchen to get more drinks. Standing alone at the counter, I looked into the reflection in the glass and saw a face so calm it almost felt unfamiliar. There was no embarrassment, no burst of anger, only a silence deep enough to make me realize I had gotten used to moments like this without even noticing when that happened. When I returned to the living room, the conversation had shifted to investment and finance, a subject Daniel always loved performing in. He talked about the market, about strategy, about the way he made decisions and how those decisions produced profit. A colleague asked him how he balanced work and family. Daniel shrugged and answered casually, "I just focus on making money. Emily handles the rest." He said it like a compliment, but the way he said it turned it into a statement of position. I stood there listening, feeling each sentence like a series of small waves touching the shore, not strong enough to cause pain, but enough to remind me of a truth that was already there. I looked around the room, at the people nodding along, and wondered whether they would still be laughing if they knew the full picture. The evening went on with stories, glasses of wine being refilled and emptied again, and laughter holding its steady rhythm. I moved between the kitchen and the living room, making sure everything ran smoothly, keeping the space perfect in the way Daniel liked. Every so often, he slipped in another small comment about me, always in the same direction, light on the surface but clear enough to shape how everyone else saw me. I did not argue. I did not explain. I simply continued playing my role that night. When the guests started leaving, Daniel stood by the door, shaking hands, receiving compliments about the dinner party and about himself. One man patted him on the shoulder and said he was lucky to have a wife like me, someone who knew how to take care of things. Daniel laughed and nodded, but his answer made me pause. "That's right," he said. "Everything runs smoothly when everyone knows their place." The days after that party moved in a familiar rhythm, but something in the way Daniel treated me began to sharpen, as though he no longer felt the need to be careful in front of anyone. Every morning, when we sat down to breakfast with the children, he slipped in comments that sounded harmless on the surface, but carried a layer underneath I could no longer ignore. When Liam asked about a new piece of technology, Daniel turned to me and said, "Asking your mother won't help. She doesn't really understand this stuff," and then continued explaining it to our son as if I were not sitting right there. Sometimes Sophie would glance at me, as if checking my reaction, but over time she began getting used to those remarks as part of normal life. I started realizing that Daniel was not simply underestimating me. He truly believed in the image of me he had built in his own mind. That was what made all of his words feel so consistent, from the way he talked to friends, to the way he spoke to our children, to the way he understood my place in the family. I did not push back, because I understood that my silence was buying me time to watch and prepare. And inside that silence, I gathered every small detail, from the remarks he made as if they meant nothing to the financial decisions he made without thinking twice. I knew that when the right moment came, all of it would connect into a picture he had never imagined. If you've made it this far into the story, take a moment and let me know where you're listening from by dropping a comment below. I'd really love to see which cities this story has reached. And if you feel connected to what's happening, or you've ever been in a similar situation, don't forget to leave a like so I know this story resonated with you. There were quiet afternoons when the house was empty except for me and the soft light falling through the windows. On those afternoons, I often sat at the small desk in the bedroom and reopened the files I had kept for years. Those documents were not the kind of thing an ordinary stay-at-home wife would have, but my life had never really been as simple as Daniel believed. Before I got married, I worked at an investment fund, where every decision was weighed through data, risk, and control. I learned how to look at a company and understand where its cash flow was going. I learned how to evaluate people through the choices they made. And most of all, I learned the value of keeping information to myself. My father was the one who built that foundation for me. He did not just leave me money. He left behind a system I could continue to operate. When he died, I inherited a portion of equity in the fund, enough to have influence without drawing too much attention. I chose not to appear directly. Instead, I stayed behind a legally registered holding company where investments could be made quietly. That choice did not come from fear. It came from a desire to control my own story in a way few people would ever notice. When Daniel started building his career in tech, he struggled far more than he ever admitted to other people. There were moments when his company was dangerously close to a cash crisis, and he brought that pressure home with him, even though he always tried to mask it with his usual confidence. I watched, I listened, and I recognized an opportunity when it appeared. Through my holding company, I entered an investment round Daniel never knew I was behind it. That capital helped keep his company alive, get it through that difficult stretch, and move it into more stable growth. Every time Daniel told the story of that turning point, he framed it as the result of his own effort and vision. And I listened like an outsider, storing every detail in memory. I was also the one quietly paying for most of the major expenses in our family, from the children's tuition and health insurance to the credit card debt Daniel believed had somehow taken care of itself long ago. All of it moved through accounts he had never looked at too closely, because he was convinced he was the one in control. Daniel began carrying his phone with him more often, even at home. He used to leave it on the kitchen table or on the couch, but now every time a message came in, he glanced at it quickly and turned the screen face down. One day, while I was tidying the living room, his phone lit up with a notification, and the name Chloe stayed on the screen just long enough for me to remember it. I did not open the phone. I did not touch it. I simply noted the detail as another piece of a picture slowly taking shape. At the same time, I began reviewing our entire financial structure, checking every account, every investment, and making sure everything was documented clearly. I did not rush into any decision because I understood that timing matters just as much as action itself. Daniel continued living his life with the same familiar confidence, and he probably believed everything was still under his control. The first time I saw Chloe, it happened in a setting where I technically should not have been there. And yet that coincidence made everything clearer than any explanation ever could. It was at a networking event hosted by Daniel's company at a hotel downtown, one he had said was strictly for internal staff and key partners. I learned about the event through an email in a system I still reviewed from time to time, and I decided to attend as an anonymous guest, using a business card tied to the holding company I operated. No one paid much attention to my presence, because those kinds of events are always crowded, and everyone is usually too focused on their own goals to notice one more face. Daniel stood near the main stage, talking with a group of guests, and beside him was a woman I had never seen before. She was much younger than I was, maybe in her late 20s, elegantly dressed, confident in the way she carried herself. Daniel leaned toward her when he spoke, standing closer than he needed to for a professional relationship. When he laughed, his eyes turned toward her more than anyone else in the group, and that alone was enough to tell me she was not just another coworker. I moved around the room, keeping enough distance to observe without drawing attention. After a while, I heard someone in the group introduce her as Chloe, part of the marketing department and recently involved in an important project Daniel was leading. The way he spoke about her was different from the way he spoke about other colleagues. He emphasized her talent and potential, yes, but there was also an emotional undertone he rarely allowed into his work voice. Chloe answered intelligently, and every now and then her gaze lingered on Daniel just a little too long, as if the two of them were sharing a rhythm the people around them did not fully notice. I picked a fairly ordinary evening to talk to Daniel, not because I thought the timing was perfect, but because I understood that conversations like this rarely come with ideal timing. The children were upstairs, the house had grown quieter, and Daniel was sitting in the living room with his laptop on his knees, the light from the screen reflecting across his face. I walked over, sat in the chair opposite him, and kept enough distance so the conversation would not feel tense from the first second. He looked up at me, clearly a little surprised to see me sitting there instead of moving around in the kitchen the way I usually did. "I need to talk to you for a minute," I began, my voice calm, with no accusation in it. Daniel nodded and closed the laptop, but his eyes held a trace of caution, as if he were trying to guess where this was going. I did not circle the subject. By then, I had too much information to feel my way around it. "You're involved with Chloe, aren't you?" The question dropped into a silence that lasted several seconds. Daniel looked at me, and I watched his expression shift quickly from surprise to the kind of calculation I had seen many times before when he faced an important decision at work. He leaned back in his chair, exhaled lightly, and gave me a smile that did not fully mean anything. "Where did you hear that?" he asked. His voice was not loud, but there was a clear layer of defense underneath it. "I asked a simple question," I replied, holding his gaze. "You can answer it or not." Daniel stayed quiet a moment longer, then shrugged, as though he had made a decision in his head. "What if I am?" he said, more directly now. "What exactly does that change?" The answer itself did not surprise me, but the way he said it made something I had already understood become even clearer. I took a slow breath and refused to let emotion drive the conversation. "It changes a great deal," I said. "It affects this family." Daniel tilted his head and looked at me with an expression caught somewhere between confusion and mockery. "This family?" he repeated. "Emily, do you really think you get to talk about what affects this family?" He put a hand on the arm of the chair, and his voice sharpened in the way he rarely bothered to hide at home anymore. "I'm the one who works every day. I'm the one bringing money home. You're living the life I built, and now you want to question my choices?" I stayed silent for a few seconds, letting his words settle into the space between us. I looked at him and tried to see whether there was still anything in his eyes that felt familiar to me from years ago. "I'm not talking about rights," I said at last, my voice steady. "I'm talking about the truth." Daniel gave a short laugh, but there was nothing warm about it. "The truth?" he said. "The truth is that you contribute nothing to what goes on in this life. You don't understand work pressure. You don't understand how this world functions. You're looking in from the outside and thinking you can judge." He said it with such certainty, as if he had believed it for years, and I could feel how wide the distance had grown between the way he saw me and who I really was. "Are you sure you understand everything?" I asked, not to challenge him, but to ask a question I knew he had never asked himself. Daniel looked at me, irritation flashing briefly across his face. "I understand enough to know I'm carrying most of this," he said. "And if you think you can stand here and judge me, maybe you should take a good look at where you stand first." The sentence hung there between us with all the certainty of something he believed was true. I did not argue further because I realized this conversation was not the place where his mind was going to change. I stood up, adjusted my sleeve, and looked at him one last time that night. "I've already looked very carefully," I said quietly, but clearly enough for him to hear. A few days after that conversation, Daniel brought up divorce himself one evening that on the surface looked as ordinary as any other. "I think we should end this," he said, his voice even, without hesitation. I did not act surprised because the conversation before had led here in a way that felt almost logical. I gave a small nod and let him continue. Daniel seemed to have expected a stronger reaction, but when none came, he leaned forward slightly as if trying to take control of the exchange. "I've already spoken to a lawyer," he said. "Everything will be simpler if we agree early. I'll keep this house, since it's tied to my work and my connections. The kids should stay here for stability. I have the financial capacity to provide for them." I listened to every sentence without interrupting, letting him complete the full shape of the argument he had prepared. The way he laid it out reminded me of the proposals he used to build, where every element was arranged to lead toward the conclusion he wanted. "And me?" I asked lightly, not confrontational, only precise. Daniel shrugged, as if the question were not especially complicated. "I'll support you for a while," he said, "until you figure things out. But you understand that you need to start thinking about standing on your own. You can't depend on me forever." He said it with the certainty of a man offering practical advice. I looked at him and watched how thoroughly he believed his own version of events. "You think I'm not capable of standing on my own?" I asked, not to argue, but to clarify what exactly he believed. Daniel exhaled and rubbed his forehead, as if trying to stay patient. "Emily, we both know you haven't had a stable income in years," he said. "I'm not saying that to hurt you. It's just reality. I've carried most of the financial responsibility. That needs to be reflected in how we divide things." I nodded, taking in each point as he made it. In my mind, numbers, contracts, and accounts had already begun rearranging themselves into a picture entirely different from the one he was describing. "Have you finalized everything with your lawyer?" I asked. "Almost," Daniel said. "As soon as you agree, everything can move quickly. I think this is the best solution for both of us." I held his gaze and let a short silence sit between us before answering. "Are you sure?" I asked, my tone unchanged, though the question carried a layer of meaning he did not yet hear. Daniel frowned slightly, clearly not understanding why I would ask that. "I've thought this through very carefully," he said. "I know what I'm doing." I leaned back in my chair and felt calm spread even further through my thoughts. The conversation was unfolding exactly the way I had expected, and each sentence from Daniel only made clearer how he saw the world. "If that's your decision," I said, "then I'll review it." Daniel nodded, seeming satisfied with my response. He stood, gathered a few plates from the table, and moved with the air of a man who believed a negotiation had just been settled. "I'll send the documents over in a few days," he said over his shoulder. After the conversation about divorce, I did not spend time thinking in the way Daniel probably imagined I would, because the next steps had already been in motion long before that night. The following morning, while the house was still quiet and the children were still asleep, I sat down at my desk, opened my laptop, and accessed the management system I had maintained for years. Accounts, reports, and records appeared in a structure so clear that each section reflected another part of the financial picture Daniel had never seen in full. I began reviewing everything again, from share ownership and investment agreements to the recurring payments I had been making on behalf of the family. I sent an email to my lawyer with all the necessary data attached, preparing for a scenario Daniel had never considered possible. The email itself was brief, focused on confirming asset ownership, the scope of control over the relevant companies, and the legal provisions that could be activated when needed. Then, I drafted another email, this time to the board of directors at Daniel's company. I used the official address representing my holding company, a name they were familiar with from investment reports, though they had never connected it directly to me. In that message, I requested an emergency meeting on the grounds of management performance and strategic direction going forward. The first replies from the board came quickly, agreeing on a time and place. I confirmed the schedule and made sure it landed on a day when Daniel would be in the office, fully prepared for what he assumed would be an ordinary workday. That overlap was not random. It was the result of my having tracked his schedule over a long period of time. That morning began like a normal workday for Daniel, and I knew he left the house believing he was moving toward an important milestone in his career. He wore the navy suit he usually chose for major meetings, adjusted his tie in the mirror, and said that today might turn out to be a good day. I stood in the kitchen pouring coffee, nodded as I always did, and kept the atmosphere light and familiar. When the door closed behind him, I looked at the clock, confirmed the timing, and went back into my study to prepare for my own part in that day. I chose an outfit that was simple but sharp, far removed from the image I usually wore at home. Every detail was deliberate, from the color palette to the way I tied back my hair, because I understood that in a room like a boardroom, a first impression is shaped not only by what people say, but by how they arrive. When I walked into the building where Daniel's company was headquartered, no one recognized me in the way they were used to, because I did not arrive beside him, and I was not carrying the role of someone's wife. I used the visitor credentials that had been arranged in advance and went straight up to the meeting floor, where the board members were already beginning to gather. I took the seat prepared for me, laid my materials on the table, opened my laptop, and reviewed one last time the data that would be presented. The atmosphere in the room held that familiar focus of places where every decision is weighed against concrete information. Daniel walked into the room a few minutes later, carrying the confidence I had seen in him so many times before. He looked around, greeted everyone, and then his eyes landed on me for the briefest moment. I saw recognition there immediately, but mixed with a kind of confusion he had not yet found words for. He said nothing at first, perhaps because he assumed there had to be some reasonable explanation for my presence that he simply had not figured out yet. He took his seat, but every now and then his eyes returned to me, as if he were trying to piece together a story whose parts still did not fit. The meeting opened with the usual reports on performance, revenue, and growth plans. Daniel presented his section fluently, using the numbers and charts he had prepared. His voice retained its confident rhythm, and the room listened with attention. I watched, noting every point he emphasized, every way he framed the results, and I could see that he still believed he controlled the entire picture. When the discussion moved into strategic review, the chairman turned to me, introduced me as the representative of the controlling shareholder, and invited me to speak. That moment changed the atmosphere in the room completely. Daniel turned fully toward me, and the confusion in his face sharpened into a clear question he still could not speak aloud. I stood, opened the file on the screen, and began speaking in a calm, steady voice. "I'd like to begin by clarifying several factors related to ownership structure and cash flow," I said, letting my gaze move across the room before resting on Daniel for the briefest moment. "What you are looking at here," I continued, "is the company's actual cash flow over the past 5 years. The chart displayed the major investments, the capital injections, and the points at which the money changed direction during critical phases. At 2 key moments, when the company was facing liquidity risk, a back-end investor provided the necessary capital," I said, moving the pointer toward the 2 marked points on the chart. "That investor did not appear directly in meetings, but held an equity position significant enough to influence strategic decisions." Daniel sat up straighter, his eyes moving quickly across the details on the screen, as if he were trying to connect information he had never seen placed together in one frame before. I did not look at him for too long, but long enough to recognize the tension slowly beginning to show in the way he held himself. "The holding company behind those investments," I said, "is the entity I represent here today. That means the majority of the capital that allowed this company to survive its most difficult period did not come from internal decisions, but from a financial structure that had been put in place long before." I opened a more detailed set of data listing the payments themselves, the timing, and the terms attached to them. Those funds included debt restructuring, working capital support, and liquidity protection for major projects. Daniel raised a hand as if he meant to interrupt, but stopped when he realized that every pair of eyes in the room was now fixed on this unfolding situation. I continued, my tone unchanged. "There is also another factor that needs to be clarified," I said, moving into the section related to personal financial conduct. "Several major expenditures tied to executive activity, including travel, entertainment, and credit card charges, were paid through accounts linked to the holding company." I did not need to name him directly. The data on the screen made it obvious enough. The room grew heavier, not because anyone expressed tension openly, but because of the deliberate silence of people processing what they were seeing. Daniel looked at the figures on the screen, then back at me, his eyes carrying a question he still could not put into words. I held his gaze without looking away, because this was the moment the pieces truly began to lock into place. "I want to emphasize that these figures are not being presented for personal reasons," I said, though I knew perfectly well the impact was falling very specifically on one person. "They reflect the way this company has functioned over a long period of time, and they also reveal its dependency on resources that were not always fully acknowledged." I moved to the final slide of that section, where the major figures and their relationships were summarized. When I stopped, the room remained quiet, but it was no longer the same kind of quiet that had existed at the beginning. It carried a new awareness, a different understanding of what had actually happened. Daniel was no longer looking at the screen. He was staring directly at me, as though trying to confirm that everything he had just heard was real. I ended my presentation with one simple sentence. "I believe the board will need to reconsider several assumptions before making its next decision." Then I sat down, placed my hands on the table, and let everyone else begin responding. In that moment, I knew the line between the story Daniel had built and the reality I had just presented had been officially erased, and from that point forward, everything would move in a direction he could no longer control. The atmosphere in the boardroom changed visibly after I finished speaking, and the shift did not need explanation to become obvious. A few board members exchanged glances, then looked back down at the documents in front of them as if confirming what they had just heard. The chairman gave a slight nod, then spoke in a calm voice, weighted with decision. He said the company needed clarity regarding management responsibility and transparency in spending, especially given that the information presented showed a clear disconnect between internal reporting and actual cash flow. Daniel sat across from me, his back still straight, but his hands were now clasped on the table, a sign I had come to recognize when he faced something he had not anticipated. He looked around the room as though searching for footing among the people he had worked with for years, but all he found were cautious faces. Another board member spoke up and suggested the executive team's use of resources needed to be reevaluated, and the question was framed with a directness that left no space for evasion. I did not join the exchange. I simply listened and watched the story slowly turn. Daniel finally spoke, his voice still controlled, but carrying a tension that had not been there before. He said the financial decisions had been made in the company's best interest and that every expense had served growth. He tried to keep his defense professional, the way he always did in important meetings. The chairman listened, then asked a short, precise question about why certain personal expenses had been paid through linked accounts without clear authorization. The question was not accusatory, but it was specific enough to require an honest answer. Daniel paused for a moment, clearly calculating his phrasing, then said they had been temporary advances and would have been adjusted later. I looked down at the data in front of me, where the numbers had already spoken more clearly than any explanation he could offer. The gap between what he was saying and what the records showed was sitting in plain view before everyone in the room. Another board member proposed a pause to consider next steps, and the atmosphere became even more focused, the way it does when a consequential decision is about to be made. After a brief exchange among the key members, the chairman turned back to Daniel. His tone remained calm, but grew more definitive. Based on the information now available, and in order to preserve management transparency, the company needed to make an immediate change in leadership. He paused for one beat, then continued. Daniel's position would be terminated effective immediately, and an interim appointment would be made to assume his responsibilities. The sentence dropped into the room with a weight no one could ignore. Daniel looked at the chairman, then turned to me, his eyes widening as if searching for some sign that this was only a misunderstanding. "This is a joke, right?" he said, his voice lower now, carrying a confusion he could no longer hide. No one answered immediately. The chairman held his gaze steady. No one else in the room spoke either. That silence confirmed more than words could have. I remained seated, revealing nothing, because everything had unfolded according to the sequence I had prepared. Daniel leaned back in his chair as if trying to keep his balance inside a situation he had never even imagined. He opened his mouth as though he meant to say more, but stopped when he realized none of his earlier arguments fit the reality of this room anymore. A company legal representative entered carrying the documents needed to formalize the process, and that made everything feel final in a way nothing else could. The meeting ended in a rhythm completely different from the one it had begun with. People left the room with folders in hand and private thoughts they had not yet fully sorted through. I packed up my laptop slowly, in no hurry at all, because I knew the most important part of the day had already happened. When I stood, Daniel was still sitting in his chair, eyes lowered to the table, as if trying to reconstruct a picture that had just been shattered. I did not walk over to him right away. I let him have a few seconds alone with himself before I headed out. He saw me almost immediately, and this time he did not avoid my eyes. He walked toward me, closing the distance between us in the way that usually leads to a conversation neither person can avoid. "Emily," he said. His voice no longer held the certainty it once did. There was a roughness in it now, as if he had either said too much or swallowed too much at once. I turned to face him, keeping enough space between us that neither of us had to raise our voice. "What do you need?" I asked, my tone calm, not cold, but stripped of the familiarity our old conversations used to carry. Daniel took a breath, lifted a hand to his forehead, then let it drop, a gesture I had seen many times when he stood in front of difficult professional decisions. "I don't know," he said. The answer came slowly, as if he were searching for language as he spoke. "I don't understand what just happened." I looked at him for a few seconds without interrupting, letting him hear his own sentence. "You saw everything in that room," I said quietly but clearly. "It was all presented." He shook his head and took another step closer, as if trying to narrow not only the physical distance between us, but the distance in understanding. "I didn't know you. I didn't know you were connected to all of that," he said, his eyes searching my face for something to hold on to. "Why did you never tell me?" The question hung between us, carrying a kind of confusion I had never seen him show before. I kept my gaze steady and did not look away, because the answer was not something simple enough to fit into an easy explanation. "You never asked," I said, my voice low but clear enough for every word to land. Daniel stood still, as if the answer required time to settle inside him. He looked at me, then looked down the hallway as though trying to replay all the years behind us through an entirely different lens. "I thought," he began, then stopped, unable to finish the sentence. His silence this time was no longer control. It was a sign that something inside him was beginning to shift. I did not step into that silence, because I understood that some realizations can only arrive when a person has to face them alone. Daniel looked back at me, and his expression softened. There was a sincerity in his face I had not seen for a long time. "I was wrong," he said, without hesitation this time. "I looked at you in a way that wasn't right." I listened and felt the sentence for what it was, part of a process he had only just begun, but I did not let it change my position in that moment. "That doesn't change what happened," I said, my voice balanced, holding both feeling and reason at once. Daniel nodded slowly, as if he accepted that even though he was not fully ready for it. He looked down, then back up, and I could see he was searching for some way to hold on to part of the life he had just lost. "Can we talk more?" he asked, his voice lower now, carrying a hesitation I had never heard from him before. I looked at him for a long moment, not weighing the answer itself, but what it meant inside the whole story. "We'll talk," I said, not rushing, "but not here." That evening, when I came back home, everything looked the same as before. Yet the feeling in the house had changed in a way only the people living inside it could recognize. Liam was in the living room with his school books spread out in front of him, and Sophie was stretched across the couch, half watching a children's program while scribbling notes for homework. I stepped inside, set down my bag, and greeted them in the most normal voice I could manage, because I knew the way I entered that moment would shape how they absorbed what was coming next. They looked up, answered with the usual greetings, and showed no sign that they knew anything had changed that day. Daniel came home a little later. When the door opened, both children turned instinctively toward the sound of his footsteps. But this time the air no longer held the same ease it usually did in the evenings. He walked in, taking off his coat more slowly than usual, his eyes passing over the living room before stopping on me for a brief second. I noticed the awkwardness in the way he moved, something he rarely let the children see. Liam spoke first, with the unfiltered curiosity of a boy his age. "How was work today, Dad?" he asked, not knowing the question had landed directly on the one thing Daniel was not ready to face. Daniel froze for a second, as if he needed to rearrange the answer in his mind before saying it. "A little complicated," he said, keeping his surface calm but without the usual certainty the kids were used to hearing. Sophie sat up and looked from Daniel to me, then back to him, as if she were trying to read something from both our faces. "Did something happen?" she asked, more quietly, but more directly. I walked closer and rested a hand on the back of her chair, a way of keeping connection without rushing into explanation. I looked at Daniel and realized he was standing between two choices: either continue protecting the image he had built for years, or begin telling the truth in a way he never had before. He let out a quiet breath, then sat down across from the children. "I don't work at that company anymore," he said. He spoke slowly, as if trying to hear the sentence himself as he said it. That answer created a clean silence in the room. Liam frowned, looking at his father with confusion, while Sophie turned toward me, her eyes carrying a question she had not yet said aloud. "What do you mean?" Liam asked, tension creeping into his voice. "Did you quit?" Daniel shook his head and paused before replying. "Not exactly," he said. The answer was shorter now, but it carried a meaning both children could feel. I saw Liam sit up straighter, while Sophie reached for my sleeve, searching for a clearer explanation from me. I sat beside Sophie, placed a hand on her shoulder, and chose honesty without turning it into a burden. "There were some changes at your dad's company," I said slowly, giving them both time to take it in. "And your dad is going to need some time to sort things out." Liam looked from me to Daniel, and I could see his expression changing from confusion into the dawning recognition that this situation was more serious than anything he had known before. "So, what happens next?" he asked, not just to his father this time, but to both of us. Daniel did not answer right away, and that silence left Liam's question hanging in the room. In that moment, I could feel the children beginning to reassess the roles each of us had held in the family. Sophie leaned lightly against me. Liam kept looking at Daniel, but he was no longer leaning toward him with the same unquestioning trust as before. The days that followed moved in a completely different rhythm, and I could clearly see Daniel beginning to face consequences he had never imagined would belong to him. On the first morning after leaving the company, he still woke up at the usual hour, put on a shirt, and made coffee, but he no longer rushed out the door. He stayed at the breakfast table longer, staring at his phone, scrolling through emails and messages, most of which brought him nothing concrete. I watched from the kitchen and realized that the emptiness in his schedule was not just a matter of time. It was a change in the way he defined himself. Over the next several days, Daniel started reaching out to work contacts, sending emails, making calls, setting up meetings, hoping to find a new opportunity. But the responses he got were no longer the kind he used to expect. Some people replied politely, but kept their distance obvious. Others delayed or did not answer at all. I watched him reread those messages more than once, as if searching for some sign that everything was still within his control. Their silence said more than any direct refusal could have. Financially, the shifts also started becoming more visible. Expenses Daniel once never thought twice about now turned into something he had to consider. One afternoon, I saw him sitting at the table with credit card statements spread out in front of him, going through each page with a level of concentration I had never seen from him in that kind of setting. He paused at certain lines, frowned, wrote things down, as if he were trying to reorganize his understanding of what had really happened over the years. I did not interrupt. I knew this was a process he had to move through alone in order to see the full picture. Daniel also began speaking to me differently. His questions no longer came in the form of assumptions. They started sounding like requests for information. One evening, while we sat in the living room, he asked me about several household expenses. His voice stayed calm, but the seriousness underneath it was impossible to miss. I answered directly, gave him the information he needed, and did not wrap it in emotion. The conversation was brief, but it was enough for him to realize there were many things in this life he had never actually understood. The final real conversation between Daniel and me happened one evening when the house had gone quieter than usual, as if everything had made room for a moment that could no longer be postponed. "I want to talk to you," he said first. His voice was lower, stripped of the familiar controlling edge. I gave a small nod, signaling for him to continue, leaving enough space for him to say everything he needed to say. Daniel looked down at his hands for a moment, then lifted his eyes again. This time there was a sharper focus in his face. "I've thought a lot about what happened," he said, choosing each sentence with care. "And I realize I didn't understand you. I didn't understand what you were doing, and I didn't understand the way we were living together all this time." I listened without interrupting, because I knew these words were not coming easily to him. Daniel continued, his voice growing steadier the deeper he moved into what he was trying to say. "I always believed I was the one holding everything together," he said. "I thought I was the one bringing stability, and I saw you in a way that was simpler than reality." He paused, searching for the right word, then said it plainly. "I was wrong." That moment did not feel like victory. It only clarified the distance between what had happened and what was finally being acknowledged. I kept my gaze steady and did not let emotion overtake the way I responded. "Why are you saying this now?" I asked, not to challenge him, but to understand what exactly he was reaching for. Daniel leaned slightly forward, as if trying to narrow the space between us. "I want us to have a chance to fix this," he said. There was genuine sincerity in his voice, but there was hope too. "I know everything went too far, but I believe we could start over, in a different way." I took a slow breath and answered from the full weight of everything that had happened, not just from that one moment. "What do you think would be different if we tried again?" I asked. My tone was calm. It was not rejection, but it was not acceptance either. Daniel thought for a few seconds before answering. "I would listen to you more," he said. "I wouldn't make the same assumptions. I want to understand you, really understand you, instead of just seeing what I thought was true." "That's something you could have done a long time ago," I said softly, but clearly. "You had plenty of chances to ask, to listen, to see things differently." Daniel nodded slowly. He did not argue, because he knew it was true. "I know," he said, "and I can't go back and change what happened, but I still want to try from here." I leaned back in my chair and felt an almost complete clarity in my own mind. This was not the first time we had talked about our relationship, but it was the first time we had done it with total honesty. "What are you trying for?" I asked. "For us, or for what you lost?" That question kept him quiet longer. He looked down, then back at me, and when he answered, there was real honesty in his eyes. "Probably both," he said. "I don't want to lose you. And I don't want to keep living with the kind of wrong understanding I had before." I gave a small nod, acknowledging the truth in the answer, but not allowing it to alter the conclusion I had already reached. "I understand," I said, "but understanding doesn't mean going back." Then I continued, my voice steady in the same way it had been throughout the conversation. "The problem isn't only what you did," I said. "It's the way you saw me for such a long time. That can't be changed with one conversation." The morning I signed the divorce papers, everything unfolded with a calm I had never imagined beforehand. I sat in my lawyer's office, a stack of carefully prepared documents laid out in front of me, each page reflecting one part of the life Daniel and I had built over 15 years. Light from the window fell across the desk, creating a clarity in the room that left no space for hesitation or unprocessed emotion. My lawyer walked me through each clause, reviewing the key points to ensure I fully understood and agreed to every part of it. I listened, not because I did not already know, but because I wanted to confirm one last time that everything was proceeding exactly the way I had prepared it to. Asset ownership, the financial structure, and the terms of division were all laid out transparently. The house we had been living in, the investment portfolio, and the assets held through the holding company all remained within my control, backed by legal documentation I had maintained for years. Daniel would retain access to certain personal property, but nowhere near enough to keep what he had once believed was his. When my lawyer slid the papers toward me, I picked up the pen and paused for a brief second. Not because I doubted my decision, but because I understood the meaning of the act. My signature would not simply end a marriage. It would also close a chapter in which I had chosen silence in order to protect things more important than my own pride. I signed decisively, each letter clean and deliberate, then set the pen down and felt a kind of relief spread through me in its own quiet way. When my lawyer slid the papers toward me, I picked up the pen and paused for a brief second, not because I doubted my decision, but because I understood the meaning of the act. My signature would not simply end a marriage, it would also close a chapter in which I had chosen silence in order to protect things more important than my own pride. I signed decisively, each letter clean and deliberate, then set the pen down, and felt a kind of relief spread through me in its own quiet way. Daniel arrived a little late, and when he stepped into the room, I could see clearly how much had changed in the way he carried himself. The old confidence was gone. In its place was a heaviness I had never seen in him before. He sat across from me, looked down at the paperwork, then lifted his eyes again and held my face as if searching for something that might still be there. The lawyer reviewed the terms with him, and Daniel listened in silence. Every so often he nodded. Occasionally he asked a brief question to clarify a point, but most of the time he simply looked at the pages, as if reading the whole story of his life again from an angle he had never considered. When it was time to sign, he picked up the pen, paused longer than I had, and then finally lowered it to the page. There was none of the drama people often imagine in a divorce. No accusations, no emotional eruption, only a final kind of silence in which we both understood that everything had reached the point where there was no way back. Once the paperwork was complete, the lawyer gathered the files, confirmed that everything had been processed properly, and then left us alone for a few brief minutes before stepping out. Daniel looked at me. His eyes were no longer searching for answers. They carried an acceptance I knew had taken him many days to reach. "I hope you'll be okay," he said quietly, without any remaining defensiveness. I gave a small nod. There was no need to say much, because what needed to be understood had already been said through our actions. When I walked out of the office, the air outside felt wider somehow, as if one chapter had closed and made room for another direction. I did not turn back to look. I knew everything behind me had already served its role in my life. What remained was not loss. It was clarity, something that had taken me years to reach. And for the first time, I felt like I was walking entirely in the direction I had chosen for myself. The first weeks after everything was finalized moved at a slower pace, but with more clarity than any stage of my life before that. The house still held the same familiar shape, but the way I experienced the space had changed. It was as if each corner now reflected a kind of self-possession I had never named before. I began reorganizing my schedule with more freedom, giving my investment work a more visible role, no longer hiding behind the layers I had maintained for years. Meetings, financial decisions, and conversations with partners became more direct, and I realized I did not need to reduce my own presence in order to preserve balance for anyone else. Liam and Sophie slowly adapted to the new rhythm as well. At first, they both spoke more cautiously, as if observing the house to better understand what had changed. I chose to talk to them openly, without avoiding their questions, but also without making everything feel heavy. I explained responsibility to them, the different ways people can contribute to a life together, and I could see that understanding slowly take shape in the way they looked at things. Liam began offering help around the house more naturally. Sophie often sat beside me while I worked, curious about the numbers and charts she had never paid attention to before. Sometimes I thought about the past, not with regret, but with a clearer understanding of the choices I had made. I realized that keeping silent for so long had not been weakness. It had been a strategy I chose in a very specific context, but I also understood that every phase has its ending, and stepping out of an old role is not a form of loss. It is the beginning of a new direction. When I look at my life now, I do not see an empty space that needs to be filled. I see a wide open field where I can continue building things in the way I want to build them. What I have now did not come from proving anything to anyone else. It came from understanding exactly who I am and which direction I want to move in. And for the first time in years, that feeling is solid enough that I no longer need to look over my shoulder for confirmation. I do not see Daniel often now that everything is over, but from time to time we still communicate about the children. In those conversations, I can hear how much his life has changed in ways he never imagined. He moved out of the old house, rented a smaller apartment, and started over in a far simpler rhythm than the one he once lived in. Our short conversations usually revolve around Liam and Sophie's schedules, but between the lines, I can still hear the difference in his voice, a quietness that used to be rare. Daniel found another job after a period of searching, but the position no longer came with the power or income he once had. He works longer hours now, and the way he talks about work has changed. The old pride is gone, replaced by a focus on maintaining stability. I do not ask for details, but from the way he talks, I understand that he is learning again how to build things from the most basic foundation. When he sees the children, I notice he listens to them more. He pays attention to the small things he used to overlook. Liam told me his dad has become more patient when helping with homework. Sophie said he now asks her how she feels during the day, something he almost never did before. Those are not dramatic changes from the outside, but they are enough for me to understand that he is trying to reshape himself in a different direction. I do not know where Daniel's path will lead him, but I can see clearly that he is living with the consequences of his past choices more directly now. Without the layers he once relied on, he has no choice but to look at himself and build from there. And while that process is not easy, it is necessary if he is ever going to understand the person he wants to become. When I look back at the full shape of my story, I realize that what happened was not simply the collapse of a marriage. It was the collision between perception and reality, two things we had maintained for years. Daniel was not a bad man in the simplest sense, but he allowed his confidence to become a narrow lens, one through which a person's worth was measured only by what could be seen immediately. When someone grows used to being recognized without having to ask deeper questions, it becomes very easy for them to overlook the quiet but important forces surrounding them. As for me, the silence I chose for so long was not always the best solution. It gave me control over the situation, but it also created a gap others could easily misunderstand. I had grown accustomed to watching and preparing, but that also meant I delayed conversations that needed to happen. When a relationship loses honest exchange, assumptions slowly replace truth, and eventually the distance becomes too wide to close.
Hello, everyone. I'm Sophia, the host of Hope Tales. If you've stayed with this story all the way to this point, then maybe you can already feel that this is not just about a marriage falling apart, but about a journey of realization in how we choose to see the person beside us. I'm not telling this story so you can see one woman win or one man lose, because real life is not that simple. I'm telling this story because there are things so many women have lived through, and yet have never truly named. Emily's story is not just about a woman being looked down on by her husband and then pulling off some dramatic reversal. If that were all it was, then it would only be entertainment. But what I can't forget about this story is the silence. A silence that lasted 15 years. A silence that so many women out there are living with every single day. How many of us have been placed into a role that someone else chose for us? A wife who just stays home. A woman who doesn't make money. Someone who doesn't understand the big things. And then, over time, we begin to shrink ourselves to fit that role. Not because we are weak, but because we want to keep the peace, keep the family together, hold on to the things we believe matter more than our own ego. But this is what I really want you to stop and think about. Every kind of peace comes with a price. And if that price is slowly losing your voice, slowly losing your sense of worth, then that is no longer peace. That is a trade. Emily chose silence for a very long time. And honestly, I understand that choice. There are seasons in life when we cannot fight back, not because we are not strong enough, but because the timing is not right. But the real issue is not how long you stay silent. It is whether you know when you need to stop. A lot of women do not leave, not because they cannot, but because they have grown so used to being diminished that they start to think it is normal. They begin to doubt themselves. They begin to believe they really are not enough. And that is the most dangerous part of all. You do not have to own a company like Emily to understand your own worth. You do not need some spectacular twist to prove who you are. Your value does not depend on whether other people recognize it. It depends on whether you can see it for yourself. This story is also a very clear reminder. Real power is not about how loudly you speak. It is about understanding exactly where you stand. But if you hide that power for too long, if you never allow other people to see who you truly are, then eventually you can become trapped inside the version of you that they created. And for the men listening to this story, I want to say something plainly too. Never assume you fully understand the woman beside you just because you are the one making money. Respect does not come from roles. It comes from the way you recognize another person's value, even when that value does not fit the things you are used to measuring. Daniel did not lose everything in a single day. He lost it little by little, starting with the way he chose to see the woman beside him. And when the truth finally came out, it was not just his job that collapsed. It was the entire belief system he had built his life on. So if you are in a relationship where you feel small, where you feel dismissed, listen to that feeling. Do not brush it aside too quickly. Do not rush to comfort yourself with the idea that things will work themselves out. Things only get better when you face them. You do not need to break everything apart overnight. You do not need to become a stronger version of yourself in a single night. But you do need to begin with one very small thing: being honest with yourself. Are you really okay? Are you being respected? Are you being seen for who you truly are? And if the answer is no, then you deserve something better. Emily's story is not about defeating a man. It is about the fact that she finally chose to stand on her own side. And sometimes, that is the hardest victory of all. If you see yourself somewhere in this story, I want you to know that you are not alone. There are so many people out there living through something similar. They just have not said it out loud yet. And maybe hearing this story today is the beginning of something different for you. If this story made you think, leave a comment below and share how you feel. I truly do read them. And if you want to hear more stories like this, stories that are not just meant to be heard but meant to help us understand, reflect, and change, then do not forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. I'm Sophia, and I'll see you again in the next stories, where maybe you just might find yourself in them.